Hi, welcome to this episode of Protect Privacy Now. Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Bob Goodlatte. I served in the United States House of Representatives from 1993 to 2019. And most particularly, I served on the Judiciary Committee that entire time and served as chairman for my last 6 years from 2013 to 2019. I'm delighted to have with us today Liza Goitein, who is the director of the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. Liza, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit more about the Brennan Center and about what you do as co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program.
Sure. Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be here. The Brennan Center is an independent, nonpartisan organization that works to reform, revitalize, and where necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. I co-direct the Liberty and National Security Program, and the mission of that program is to advance effective national security policies that respect constitutional values and the rule of law. And I've been here for 13 years, and it's a terrific organization doing terrific work.
And I can say that as a senior policy advisor for the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability, which hosts this podcast, that I've enjoyed working with you on a weekly basis, sometimes daily basis, to promote privacy and protection of people's Fourth Amendment rights. Our organizations work very closely together, along with a number of other important civil liberties organizations. So thank you for that as well. Today we wanted to talk about very specifically the problem of the government buying data from data brokers and other sources to use to gather information about U.S. citizens and others. And in particular, we'll mention that there's a piece of legislation that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. Liza, we know in the back of our heads that there's a lot of very specific and very personal data about all of us that social media platforms and apps are collecting to sell to advertisers. But many people don't know that the federal government, particularly law enforcement agencies, but many other agencies as well, and certainly intelligence agencies, are also accessing our personal information by purchasing it. So let's start out by telling us, how do they purchase it? Who do they purchase it from? And what kind of information do these purchases contain about us?
Yeah, so let's take a step back. When you use a social media platform or an app or even just a web browser, you are disclosing a trove of personal information. If you're using a social media platform, you're most likely disclosing demographic information, your age, your marital status, etc. If you're using an app that maybe tracks your fitness or your health, you may be disclosing sensitive medical information. If you're on Amazon buying things, you're disclosing your purchase history. All of this information is incredibly valuable to advertisers because they can use it to target their ads more effectively and make more money. So there's a huge market for your personal data. And the way it usually works is that the companies that collect the data in the first instance will sell it to data brokers. They will repackage the data or categorize it or analyze it in ways that makes it more useful to the end user and then sell it at a handsome profit. But it's not just advertisers who are buying this information, it's the government too. And there's a particular type of information that's of great interest to the government, and that is your location information. And online service providers, apps, communication service providers of all kinds are collecting your location information, sometimes only when you're using the service, but sometimes all the time. And then again, they can sell that to data brokers who can then resell it to the government. And while your whereabouts at any particular moment may not necessarily seem that revealing, a comprehensive record of your movements over time can be incredibly revealing of very personal things about you, your associations, your activities, your habits, even your beliefs. And that's particularly true when all of that data is sort of run through these sophisticated computer algorithms that can crunch the data and tease out patterns. Federal agencies, as well as state and local law enforcement, have been purchasing databases of information, sensitive information, including Americans' geolocation information. We know this not because they told us so. This has been happening secretly, but because investigative reporters have discovered it and have disclosed that, you know, a whole alphabet soup of federal agencies, the FBI, the IRS, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency Administration, the let's see, DOD, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, all of them have purchased databases of Americans' sensitive information. And in general, this information that is sold by data brokers comes in a form that is anonymized, you know, aggregate information. It doesn't have your name on it. However, it is disturbingly easy to de-anonymize this data using just various other pieces of information that either come with the data or are available publicly. And multiple studies have shown that it's really child's play to de-anonymize the data. So this is very personal information that the government is collecting that it can link to you.
Well, a lot of our listeners may be wondering, don't you need a warrant to access such personal information as required by the Fourth Amendment? Yeah. Isn't all this unconstitutional?
Excellent question. The Fourth Amendment applies whenever the government intrudes on a reasonable expectation of privacy. And when that happens, the government generally needs a warrant in those cases. For decades, though, the courts have followed what is called the third-party doctrine. And that's a rule that says that when you voluntarily disclose your information to a third party, you lose any reasonable expectation of privacy that you might have had in that information. So according to that rule, any information that you're giving to a social media platform, an app developer, internet service provider is not covered by the Fourth Amendment. Now, if you ask me, that rule never made any sense. Privacy is about controlling who you share your information with. So the fact that I might share some extremely personal information with my husband does not mean that I've somehow lost any interest in not sharing it with the entire world, right? That just doesn't make any sense. But even if you could argue that the doctrine had some salience when it was adopted, you know, half a century ago, today, it's just impossible to get through 24 hours without disclosing some incredibly sensitive information to a whole range of online service providers. So the third-party doctrine in the digital era really makes no sense at all. In 2018, the Supreme Court finally recognized that the third-party doctrine has its limits. And what the court held was that when the police want to get your location information from a cell phone service provider, the police have to get a warrant to get that information, because it is so sensitive. If you accumulate that information, it becomes so sensitive. And really your disclosure to the cell phone company of that information isn't in any meaningful sense voluntary. You kind of have to do it. And so for those reasons, even though you've shared it with a third party, you retain an expectation of privacy. That was a great decision, but there are two problems and two reasons why it hasn't really solved the issue. The first problem is that even though the principles in that decision would be applicable to all kinds of sensitive data that you share with third parties, the case itself only addressed location information held by cell phone service providers. And so, you know, health information, financial information, data about your communications, really anything other than this kind of location information is just not covered by the decision. But the second problem is even worse, and that is that government lawyers, executive branch lawyers, have interpreted this decision to apply only when the government is compelling phone companies to turn over the data, or whatever companies hold the information. If the government is instead just incentivizing the disclosure by writing a huge check, the Fourth Amendment goes away again. That's what the lawyers for the government have decided. And so even though the Supreme Court says this is constitutionally protected information, the government is allowing itself to buy it up in enormous data sets or buy access to these data sets without necessarily any suspicion of wrongdoing, let alone probable cause and a warrant.
Yeah, so the third party exception has been twisted by government entities and thrown back at the Supreme Court to say, well, yes, you put a limitation on what we can gather from third parties, but if somebody else gathered it about you or about me or about anybody else and is willing to sell it to the government, that's not covered by the Supreme Court decision. So the solution is either for Congress to step in and say enough's enough. We've got to have a legislative stop to this, or for the Supreme Court to recognize that this has gone too far again and continue with further judicial decisions. It might be a good time for me just to read the Fourth Amendment so people can see how far-sighted the founders were in writing our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, so not just breaking into your home, houses, papers, and effects, which is, I would think, a pretty broad coverage, against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So we're way, way, way far away from that protection when the government can simply go to a faceless data broker who has gathered information by scraping it off of Facebook and Twitter and using geolocation information that they can buy from literally thousands of apps, some of which, you're right, are tracking you all the time, and simply buy it. And I'm sure that a lot of these folks are more than happy to sell it to the government because they also sell it to a whole host of private entities who use it for a wide variety of purposes as well. So that's why we are so concerned that legislative steps be taken to address this. And of course, we're always hopeful that the court will continue to subtract from that third party exception and find more and more instances where people's expectation of privacy, which has changed so much in the digital age. I mean, what you used to keep in a shoebox under your bed or in a safe at home, or maybe that didn't even exist at all, like geolocation information, is now available and held by third parties. And of necessity, it has to be held by third parties for us to function in the digital age.
Yeah, that's really well said. And the notion that somehow, if I have some very personal documents, let's say I'm keeping a journal, but I'm typing it. I don't like to sit there and handwrite things, and I'm typing it out. The notion that if I keep that sort of on my hard drive at home, it is constitutionally protected. But if I back it up to the cloud, because I want it to be there tomorrow, if my computer, goes on the fritz or whatever, the notion that somehow just backing it up to the cloud, it somehow is no longer private because I have shared it with Google or whoever is providing the cloud service. That is not, so obviously that's not something that would have made any sense to the framers. I mean, they probably couldn't have even wrapped their mind around something like that. But it is still, those are still my papers and effects. And if the government wants to access to them, it should have to get a warrant.
So let's talk a little bit more about the Congress. We're aware of the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale Act, a bill that's been introduced. But what about existing laws? Congress is constantly struggling to try to keep up with these changes in technologies and to protect our privacy. But I know from my own experience that no sooner do you get something passed that tries to plug one area where people's privacy is invaded by government than more pop up in other areas. So what's the status of current law? Is there not any protection against this right now?
Yeah, so it's kind of a toss-up which institution is slower at keeping up with technology, Congress or the courts. And they're both pretty bad. There's a law, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, that prohibits certain companies from voluntarily disclosing data about their customers to government agencies. And the problem with the law is that it was written in 1986 and it has not been meaningfully updated since then. And of course, in 1986, most of us hadn't even heard of the internet. So the way the definitions were written in the statute in terms of who the law applies to, it covers phone companies, it would cover internet service providers, it would cover social media platforms for the most part, because they're providing communication services. It would cover some apps, but it would not cover, it certainly does not cover every company that collects our personal sensitive data, and it has no coverage whatsoever for data brokers. So even in cases where the law would prohibit a company from selling your data to government agencies, the company, there's nothing to stop the company from taking that same data, selling it to a data broker, and then the data broker turns around and sells it to the government agencies. So your personal data is essentially being laundered through a middleman. And that is this huge gap in the coverage of the law that has opened up by virtue of advances in technology, and Congress simply hasn't stepped in yet to close that gap.
No, and to your point, while I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, so in the last 6 years that I was in Congress, so up to 10 years ago, we twice passed out of the committee legislation to modernize ECPA, because even members of Congress had come to recognize that technology had changed just a little bit since 1986. Virtually everything that we use to communicate with today is dramatically different than it was then. We passed it through the House unanimously both times. I mean, it's very, very rare that you have a major piece of legislation that no one in the Congress, in the House of Representatives anyway, voted against. And in both instances, and this is probably not the program to talk about the Senate rules and how things work there and how one senator can block things, but basically in both instances, the Senate never even took up the bill and voted on it. Had they done so, it would have passed again, overwhelmingly, would have been signed into law, and frankly, we'd be operating in a somewhat different environment today. That bill should be taken up again, and I hope that this Congress or the next one does so. But I think we also need something more specifically directed to this whole question of the government buying information as opposed to simply getting it, because I have no doubt that unless that loophole were plugged in an ECPA reform bill, the government will be right back to where they are right now. So what can government learn from Americans about the data that they gather? This is the other thing that people may not be paying too much attention to. They would say, well, yeah, they know that I went here and I went there. They have geolocation information, but how could that affect an individual in terms of their privacy and lead to much more difficulties in their lives? And we're talking about law-abiding U.S. citizens.
Yeah. Well, again, it's not just where you go, right? I mean, location information sounds like just where you go, but if you accumulate that information and analyze it, you can learn almost everything about a person's private life, because you learn who they spend time with, who their associations are. You learn what their habits are like, what their activities are. You can even learn about their beliefs because you see where they pray, or you see what sorts of organizations they visit. So you can learn just an enormous amount of personal information about someone. And when you think about worst case scenario and government abuses of power, you tend to immediately, our imaginations just go to, somebody being thrown in jail, or deported, or losing their job or their livelihood. And, I certainly worry about those kinds of scenarios. I think there's reason to worry about them. There's a much more subtle and insidious harm that we need to recognize. And that's the effect on people's behavior when they know that they're being watched and tracked. And there's a history in this country, and I'm not just talking about, old history, I'm talking about very recently, and now, of law enforcement and intelligence agencies targeting people because of their race or their religion or their political beliefs or political activism. And
absolutely right.
This, right? And we are seeing this in how the government collects and uses geolocation data. So to give you a very specific and disturbing example, in 2020, Vice News reported that the Department of Defense had been buying location data of people who use a very popular Muslim prayer app that's used by 92 million people across the world. And also the Department of Homeland Security under both President Obama and President Trump was using social media posts as well as location metadata to track the movements of Black Lives Matter protesters. Now, there are going to be...
This can affect somebody no matter what their political viewpoint is, no matter what their ideological perspective is about a particular issue. Anything from visits to a Planned Parenthood clinic to a gun dealer, a store where you go and buy firearms.
Absolutely.
All of these things can affect individuals' protection in terms of government surveilling them.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though there are going to be plenty of people who won't be deterred, who will, people who will continue to attend protests, people who will still use the prayer apps, people who will still go to the gun stores, there are going to be people who very understandably are going to be chilled from participating in those activities. And that to me is a worst case scenario, a scenario in which entire groups of people feel that they cannot freely exercise their rights without Big Brother looking over their shoulder.
Now, some people have said, well, you know what? There's nothing that stops a private company from buying this information and using it to send you advertising through an email or having it pop up when you're on your Facebook page or whatever. So why should we limit the ability of the government to get this information? I would say in response, and I'd love to have your thoughts as well, but that while I think we should be doing things, given the change in technology and the change with how people store data and how they do things on the internet with a different expectation of what their privacy is, nonetheless an expectation that when they share something with somebody, they have some idea what's going to be done with it. The difference between knowing that if I buy a book on Amazon, Amazon or some other bookseller may get a hold of that information and say, Bob Goodlatte, I've got another biography because I know you like reading biographies. Here's a biography for you. There's a big difference between that and government having the data for this reason. Government can regulate you, they can tax you, they can fine you, they can charge you with a crime, they can incarcerate you, they can take virtually all of your liberties away from you with the power of that information. And if it's misused by government, and sometimes it is, and by administrations of both parties, we've had examples where there have been abuses. The fact of the matter is the power of government having this information is exactly why the Fourth Amendment was put into our Constitution at the outset in our Bill of Rights, and why there's that distinction. It doesn't say anything about what other people can do with your data. It says what government can do with your person, with your house, with your effects. And so that's the concern that I have. We want government to keep us safe. We want government to enforce the laws, but we want them to do it in such a way that protects these constitutional rights that we have and protects our privacy and protects us from being unreasonably intruded upon, which was exactly the problem that existed in our country before we became a country and why we put that provision in the Constitution.
Absolutely. I mean, I really couldn't have said it any better. I think that the key is the coercive powers of the government. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is it's not just the powers, it's not just the means, it's also the motive, right? I mean, that's the private companies who are concerned with their bottom line. They don't have the motive to persecute you because of your political beliefs. That's something that governments have done historically throughout history. That's what we worry about with the government. And it's, and I really don't want to downplay the harms of your privacy being violated by companies and having your sensitive information out there for purchase by anyone. I mean, I think that's an enormous problem, and I wish Congress would address that too. But I think there are special concerns that are unique to government intrusions on our privacy, and I think there's a good reason for that.
I'm with you, and I think, quite frankly, if legislation like the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act would be addressed, that same complaint would still be there, and I think it would be then a greater impetus for Congress to say, well, you know what? We're protecting you from unreasonable searches and seizures as the Fourth Amendment requires, but we're also now going to take a look at what needs to be done to give you greater protection in your privacy in terms of what happens to your data that of necessity you have to share in order to accomplish things on the internet, whether it's communicating with friends or as a part of work, or whether it's buying something on the internet or getting an education on the internet. All of that information is useful to somebody somewhere somehow, and you should have a greater expectation of privacy than you currently do, and Congress could take steps to protect that. But I think if you start by saying, yes, we feel so strongly about this that we, the government, because Congress is part of the government, are going to say that the government is going to live by the strictures of the Fourth Amendment, then I think that would build the momentum for doing something in the greater realm of protecting data privacy.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So do you want to say a little bit more about the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale Act?
Yeah.
Who's behind it? What does it do?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. This is a very important bill introduced by Senator Wyden. And basically, it would prohibit law enforcement and intelligence agencies from purchasing certain types of data, including communications content, but also location information and any of this customer information that's acquired by phone and internet companies and the companies that are covered under the law that I was talking about earlier. So it would prohibit the government from purchasing that information, no matter who holds the information or no matter how they got it. So it would bring third parties and data brokers into this set of prohibitions on selling information to the government. It's actually framed as a prohibition on government purchase of the information, but it's the same effect. Now, that doesn't mean that law enforcement and intelligence agencies could never access the data. They would just have to comply with the Fourth Amendment. So they would have to get a warrant if it's information that has the full coverage of the Fourth Amendment, or for other types of information that are maybe less sensitive and don't come within the protections of the Fourth Amendment, but that Congress has determined we have some privacy in, maybe a subpoena or a court order. So just depending on the type and sensitivity of the information, but there has to be some form of process, some level of individualized fact-based suspicion before the government can obtain our personal sensitive information. It can't just get around all of that by buying it. And so that's what this bill would do. It would close the ECPA loophole. The bill was introduced, I believe it was last spring, April 2021, with, I don't know, something like 20 co-sponsors, as I recall, several of whom are Republicans. And that should not be surprising. This is not a partisan issue. Privacy has never been a partisan issue. And Bob and I can attest to that. Advocates and lawmakers on the left have worked with advocates on the lawmakers on the right for years to try to rein in excessive government surveillance. And that's why I'm actually optimistic that we might be able to get something done.
So people who are watching and listening to this podcast, what would you recommend that they do to help out?
Yeah, so oddly enough, in our sort of today's kind of time of legislative inertia, the fact that a bill is a great idea and has broad bipartisan support is not enough. Things have a tendency to get stuck and not move. And really what's needed is some kind of public pressure to get lawmakers to actually take the next step and start to move the bill and start to actually go through the process of making it become law. And what I would recommend, I mean, if this law sounds like a good idea to you, call your representatives in Congress and tell them that your personal data should not be for sale. And I will tell you, as somebody who's worked on the Hill, when people pick up the phone and call their representatives, those offices take note. that makes an impression, and it does make a difference. So that's what people can do. They can contact their representatives and say, this one's important. This is not just something that you get to maybe make some statements saying it's a good idea. You need to be working to move this bill through Congress because we want it to be a law.
Yes, and I think at the end of the podcast, we'll put up some information about the bill numbers in the House and Senate and how people can go about contacting their member of the House of Representatives or their 2 United States senators. It would be extremely helpful. I know from my many, many years of service in Congress that when we started getting contact from constituents about a bill, and there are about 5,000 bills every Congress that get introduced in the House of Representatives, and the bandwidth of a congressional office with a few staff members is not able to look at each one of those in depth, but the ones where we heard from our constituents and they said, you know what, this bill is important to me. And if you can take a moment to say why, I want my privacy protected. I don't want someone else to know what I'm doing as I go about living my daily life. That will make an impression on them. So you can contact them by email, by phoning their office, going on their website, visiting their Facebook page, lots of ways to do that, attend a town meeting, so many different ways you can raise this issue and let people know just how important it is to you, their constituent, the person who is going to determine whether or not you vote for them in the November elections, I think has a real major impact. So Liza, there are some other big stories breaking. The FBI has recently admitted to the bulk collection of Americans' communications. Can you walk us through that?
So it's not actually the bulk collection of Americans' communications. What it is just an enormous number of warrantless searches.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Absolutely
Americans'
right.
information. So, but let me explain. So this is all happening under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. Section 702 was passed after 9/11, and what it does is it allows the government acting inside the United States to target foreigners overseas and collect all of their communications without having to get a warrant or any kind of individualized court order. And the idea basically is that foreigners overseas don't have any Fourth Amendment rights, and so you don't need a warrant to get that information. The catch is that, as Congress was well aware when it passed this law, if you're targeting a whole bunch of foreigners overseas, and this was a very broad authority that really put very few limits on who could be targeted, you're going to pull in a lot of Americans' communications because foreigners communicate with Americans. And if your goal in this collection was actually to get the Americans, if your interests lay in the Americans rather than the foreigners, you would have to get a warrant. So Congress did a couple of things to try to ensure that this whole thing would be constitutional. And first, it prohibited what's called reverse targeting. So the government would have to certify, essentially, that it was targeting foreigners only and that any collection of Americans' communications would be entirely incidental, right? And then the second thing that Congress did is it required the government the National Security Agency, which is sort of the primary collector here, to minimize, that's the term, the sharing, retention, and use of the incidentally acquired Americans' communications. So those were their protections. They have turned out in practice to be really almost entirely meaningless. So rather than actually minimize the retention and sharing of this data, the NSA routinely shares it with the FBI, CIA, the National Counterterrorism Center, and all of these agencies retain the data for a functional minimum of 5 years. So that's minimizing. And then even worse, once they have this data, all of the agencies have rules in place that allow them to search through the communications, looking specifically for Americans' communications. So looking for the communications of particular Americans that they're interested in. And the FBI in particular runs these searches in purely domestic investigations that have nothing to do with foreign intelligence or national security. And they do it at the earliest stage of the investigation, which is called the assessment stage, where they don't even have a factual predicate to suspect criminal activity. So we're not just talking about warrantless. We're talking about there's not really even a factual basis to suspect a crime at that point. So we knew, so having gone and certified, having made the certification that they are only interested in the foreigners, that they are not actually trying to target any Americans, they're just targeting foreigners, right? The agencies then search through all the data, looking for the communications of particular Americans. And this is just a bait and switch that drives a hole through the Fourth Amendment. We've known about this for a while, so that's not the news. What we didn't know is how often these so-called backdoor searches were happening, particularly at the FBI, which is a domestic law enforcement agency. And the FBI has resisted making that information public or disclosing that information to Congress for many, many years. But a few weeks ago, the government released an annual statistical transparency report. And in that report, the government revealed that the FBI in 2021 alone conducted 3.4 million searches for Americans' communications in databases that contain this Section 702 data. Now, the report said that this was probably an overcount. For one thing, that it could be that there could be multiple searches for the same person. So it's probably not 3.4 million Americans. But even if they're off by an order of magnitude, that is still what, roughly 1,000 searches that the FBI is conducting every day, warrantless searches in an attempt to find Americans, phone calls, text messages, and emails. So, I mean, I personally found this to be quite a shocking revelation. It's clear that this has to stop. And the solution is very simple. I mean, if the government wants to search Section 702 data for Americans' communications, data that has been collected without a warrant because the government certified that it was only targeting foreigners, it should first have to go and get a warrant. Congress actually passed, no, I'm sorry, the House actually passed legislation twice in 2014 and 2015, I think, that would do that, that would implement a warrant requirement for these US person queries, as they're sometimes called. But of course, it did not become law. So we need to revisit this. Congress needs to revisit this. Section 702 is going to be up for reauthorization in 2023. Congress should not reauthorize that law without a warrant requirement for US person queries. And we can do this, you can do this if we all, contact our representatives and tell them this is important to us. If we stay vigilant, if we stay focused and engaged, we really can force change in Washington.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And it was said almost from the founding of our country by a number of statesmen that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And when the executive branch of government, these various agencies like the FBI and the intelligence agencies abuse these powers, it's up to Congress and the courts to put a check against them, to restrain them, to write new laws and make sure old laws are being properly enforced. But it's also up to all of us, the American people, to speak up and be heard. And when we do, I think that we are ourselves remaining vigilant, and we can remain focused and engaged, and we can bring about change in Washington if we get engaged. So Liza, thank you very much for this. You're just remarkable in your knowledge of these laws and this legislation and what is going on with regard to government surveillance. So again, this is Bob Goodlatte with the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability with Liza Goitein of the Brennan Center for Justice. Be sure to follow PPSA's take on breaking news in privacy and surveillance at protectprivacynow.org. That's protectprivacynow.org. And thanks again for watching.
Thanks, everyone.